How do I know what I know? And how do I apply to the never-ending debate if God exists? Happy to see you again on my second episode of the Reality Beyond Ours. Welcome back. We often state that I need religion to tell me what is being good. But some others say that I don't need a religion to tell me what is good and what is not being good. But the question is, how do we define good? And good in whose eyes are we talking about? In our own biased selves? How often have we asked ourselves a simple yet powerful question? How do I know what I know? And by that I mean every single thing. In times of helplessness and tragedy, who really taught us to intuitively seek help from something beyond human? Such as when doctors give up, they are like, okay, pray or hope that this person is rescued. Or when we wish to pass a very difficult exam and we are like, please hope and pray to someone that I pass this exam. I need the certification. And why do we find peace, familiarity, comfort, or even these life-changing strolls through the nature, being in these expansive greens and just simply relaxing by the sea? Is our body from here? What about our soul? Where does that come from? Where does this innate sense that we have, intuition, comes from? Is it because we are? Is it because of religion? Is it because of a supernatural entity, or who is it? These questions and many others are part of the fundamental human experience, where we naturally or intuitively do actions or think a certain way. Our dependency on our upbringing cannot be underestimated here, and one must revert to those defining moments, right, when we are learning about love, gender, attraction, relationships, religion, God, and so on. Some people say we did not really grow up in a religious family. Some people say we grew up in a religious family. We learned to believe in God. It makes sense to believe in God. Some people say it does not make any sense to believe in God. So before we get really into the scientific takes also on this entire intuition thing, let's see what Allah says in the Quran about it. In Surah 30, ayah number 30, it says, "Adhere to the fitrah of Allah upon which He has created all people." Fitrah, this word became a very dear topic to scholars and theologians throughout the Islamic history, especially Sufis. Sufism, for example, is something that is very much attached to this word. But what exactly fitrah is? It is a natural disposition, which is, we will come to that a bit more on that later, upon which all humanity is created. This inner self, this intuition that is designed to seek a purpose, a higher purpose. Sometimes that people that really connect to themselves. This that goes beyond intellect. Right? So historically, renowned religious scholars such as Al-Razi, such as Ibn al-Arabi, Ibn Taymiyyah, they have worked quite a lot with fitrah, but Ibn Taymiyyah declares fitrah as an entity separate from intellect. So even if things intellectually make sense, something inside of fitrah has an instinctive repulsion to it. And hence, we cannot ignore the development of fitrah to have a wholesome approach to understanding what is happening around us. So if we are training our intellect, if we are training our mind a certain way, how often do we train our intuition, and what do we need to train our intuition? Where did this thing come from? We can call it a gut feeling as well, right? So again, more on that later. For our fitrah and as well as for our intellect, what we need is knowledge, right? So what is actually knowledge? Knowledge usually comprises of three elements: that, where, and when. So, for example, knowledge is more that is latched onto a fact, right? It tells you where it was, when it was, and what it was, like the element of that, what I referred to earlier. So, however, belief is slightly different, and I can give an easy, simple example, and you will know what I'm talking about. If someone says, Ali believes it's raining outside, opposed to if someone says Bushra knows it's raining outside. So inherently, these two statements give off a different message, right? So what is important is that belief, it can be true, but it can also be false. And that's how our brain works. But belief on the knowledge on the other hand, when I know something, this yaqeen that we have, the belief that we have, is comprised of different elements, and that contains confidence, that contains belief in truth and good basis. Now, the good basis is where the question becomes, and that is where the epistemology lies. What kind of basis sounds good? And this is where I would definitely ask my audience to do a bit more research on these credible sources of my knowledge. But that's now, we looked at the knowledge. Now let's go to the sciences of it. So what is epistemology? According to the Britannica Encyclopedia, yes, they're still out there, even if we have Wikipedia now. So epistemology is basically the philosophical study of the nature, origin, and limits of human knowledge. That's important, limits. And for discovering knowledge, there are true strands spoken of, namely rationalism and empiricism. You all are going to have a great field trip if you look at the discussions between these two people, rationalists and empiricists. It's really fun. So, but what actually is rationalism? It is the reason, it says that reason is the main source of all knowledge. And it is something that is the ability of our rational minds. And it has also three elements, which are the intuition. You have deduction, the logical premises. For example, if you see an object with three sides, you know it's a triangle. You can call it a triangle. And then you have the innate knowledge and concepts, where we say that human minds are already programmed. They have this, some kind of iOS, some operating system running on them. We don't need experience to know certain things. For example, you have an infant. He knows, by birth that how to drink, how to be breastfed. And in some forms, for example, you have this Plato's Worlds of Forms. But this is also something I'd like my viewers to read about. So it is something, this innateness is something that is based in a truth, not on our five senses. And this is exactly, for example, many new religious people base their argument of, I don't need a religion to tell me how to be a good person. So the recognition of morality is in our intuition, and it definitely guides us, or I would say, going back to the word fitra, or in other words, based on fitra, what we learn how to do, or how to know what is being good and what is not being good, and how not to go and hit someone on their face, for example. So that was rationalism. Now we look at empiricism. Empiricism argues that all knowledge must be derived from sensory experiences. And there you have the concept of tabula rasa. And this is also something, it can be an episode on its own. So please do your research on this. What tabula rasa is that it's a blank, we are a blank slate basically. So over the years within the empirical world, we go through experiences and then we create our reality. But for example, one can argue, like, how can two people attend the same school and have different skills? So there must be something apart from this tabula rasa that somehow governs what kind of skill set do I have at the end. So, for example, if someone says that all ducks are white, because that's what I have experienced, but not all ducks are white. Some of them are also not white. So then, this is where then it becomes a bit tricky. And here I would like to add an article from the Yale University by Keith D. Rose. I will definitely recommend the viewers to read that as well. It talks about epistemology, right? So when is a subject rational in believing something? When are we certain of something? When do I know for certain that something is the case? When is something doubtful for a subject or not? When is something possible? Under what condition is belief possibly false or not? So here you see that epistemology or knowledge is incomplete without looking at skepticism. And skepticism is also an important aspect for us to know, all right, it is important to doubt as well. We cannot take everything on face value. And that's where the critical thinking comes in, something that we'd covered in our previous episode. And that's why I say that me being a human is exactly this ability to critically think, to tap this dose of rationale, as well as the inner intuitions. So what do I say then at the end? That if I have to pick between rationalism and empiricism, I'm not going to give you that answer. So let's move further. So this is something that we also need to understand to address the debate about being about God or not, and about existence of God. But before we do that, last two things we will touch is foundationalism and cohortism. I am touching quite some heavy topics. So please know that I do not have the scope to make make an episode out of each of these topics. I would really invite you to take that step and perhaps inform me as well what you found out. Foundationalism, it says that there is a loop of infinite justification. So for example, you need B to prove A. And how did you prove B? Maybe because of C. But how did you prove C? Because of D. Somewhere there has to be a stop on this regression. Coheritism, on the other hand, is about it avoids the regressive argument and says that there can be circles of justification. Sometimes A can be justified by being based on B, and that's the end of it. So you see that sometimes it's difficult to pick one side of the story, right? To only pick, okay, I'm a foundationalist, or okay, then many things will not make sense in that. So using all of these skepticism, using epistemology, using the knowledge, using all of this, how do I apply this to the experience of knowing God? Dr. Nazir Khan from the Yaqeen Institute, it's a very interesting article on their website. Please have a look at it. It's called Skepticism and Atheism. He argues that often surface level polemics are in fact representatives of deeper epistemological issues. This is certainly the case with debates about the existence of God. So before even answering, prove to me that God exists, we should first examine what actually constitutes proof. What needs to be proven? And whether the one requesting proof has a coherent notion of proof to begin with. People can entertain doubt about all sorts of things. However, there is a fallacy then in thinking that we must necessarily doubt and demand proof for something before it can be established as a veritable truth. A fallacy one can term as a Pyrrhonian fallacy, after the radical skepticist of the ancient Greek, Pyrrho. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. It's Pyrrho. Pyrrho. So we see that there has to be a room given for skepticism, for us to make sure that we are not just simply following our experiences and what our intuition tells us. So there has to be some kind of a check in place. So let's dive into a little bit of skepticism before we come to the conclusion part. Ibn Taymiyyah, he's also known, Ibn Taymiyyah, also known as Shaykh al-Islam, was a deeply analytic and systematic rationalist. And his perhaps the most important contribution was to refocus debates over the interpretation of scripture back to their epistemological roots, namely the presumption that theological doctrines must be substantiated by philosophical argumentation in order to be regarded as true. Now, we need to also see that there is an epistemology related to the Quran, and that's also what something Ibn Taymiyyah talks about. So according to the Quranic epistemology, a person's faith in God is fully justified and meaningfully grounded without need for logical, deductive argumentation. And this is possible thanks to our aforementioned fitra, the natural disposition that we are born in. And actually in Quran, Allah says at one point that He has created man in perfect of form. So we are created perfectly in excellence. It's later through our choices that we become, let's say, not so perfect, so to say. So fitra then helps us to govern certain realities such as good, evil, causality, numbers, and truth, as well as the existence itself. So to deny a core pillar of one's fitra, the natural disposition we talked about, leaves a person without a coherent system of interpreting existence in a meaningful way. So that means we need to understand how the fitra works. And how often have we actually taken that step to understand our intuition, right? Before we come up with blanket statements, right? So here, it's also important that we look at the skepticism here. And for that, the Arabic word is safsata, which is a term used in the Islamic tradition to designate radical skepticism. Safsata also is related to Pyrrhonian philosophy. Here, I like to point out 3 works from Ibn Taymiyyah, which are of particular significance. That's something that I can invite my audience to review, to read. And they are definitely, not all of them, but at least something that we could read is that the repudiating the conflict between reason and revelation, because in Islamic paradigm we believe that Quran is a revelation from Allah. It's not a man-made written book. It's a book from Allah Himself. The content is from Allah. It took the book form later. It did not come down as a book. And then his work on Aristotelian epistemology, refutation of the Greek logicians, and also his work entitled Nullifying Greek Logic. It's important to mention that Greek logic and Islamic thinkers pretty much had a clash, and you will see when you do a bit more research. Al-Ghazali also, for example, wrote a book on the incoherence of Greek philosophers. And here, solipsism is also an important aspect to talk about, where we directly attack the reality. For example, movies, Matrix, Total Recall, Inception, they are pretty much prime examples of that. And actually, according to one of the Swedish philosophers, Nick Bostrom, he argued that it is far more possible that we are living in a computer simulation constructed by a technologically mature civilization than living as a physical being in nature. A similar view was also given by Elon Musk, actually. So then this begs the question, how much of skepticism is allowed and how much of it actually makes sense? So we looked at the epistemology, we looked at the skepticism, that it is important for us to know where to draw the line. But then we also need to know when, how, and who draws the line, right? So if one were to attempt to eradicate all notions of causality, logical entailment, numerical order, and magnitude from one's mind, one would be unable to make sense of anything. And then you can question the reality and the whole construct as a whole. Ludwig Wittgenstein, I hope I got that pronunciation right, spoke of such concepts as serving as metaphorical scaffolding of our thoughts, or the hinge upon which our epistemic door must turn. Just because we are able to doubt already proves the existence of some kind of reality that must exist, right? Because you are, what are you doing when we're trying to doubt? You're trying to find a reality out there. Therefore, what could exist and what not? That's the most. That's one of the core questions here. For some atheists, for example, the object of their skepticism is epistemological rather than conceptual. That is, they challenge the existence of God without challenging the concept itself as unintelligible. Indeed, some of the most vocal representatives of the new atheist movement even view the concept of God to be a hypothesis amenable to scientific falsification. So there is this element of sometimes when we try to, we also need to know why we don't believe in God. We need to be aware of that reality as well. And here, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah states that even though atheism, Inkar Thani, was never a popular viewpoint adopted by an entire nation of the known civilization, it is upheld by some people. It was upheld by some people by varying to varying degrees. For example, outwardly, as in the case of Pharaoh. If you look at the story of Pharaoh mentioned in the Quran and other religious books, he declared himself as God. So he more or less did not say that there is no such thing as God. He just said that the God is me. So there is this superpower out there, this super being. He just wanted to say that that's him. And then also the inward, the inward rebellion towards it, and that was done at the time of Abraham. So if we study the life of Abraham, we will come to know what was the statement of that ruler at that time. However, going back, Ibn Taymiyyah states this does not negate that recognition. Ma'rifah of God is firmly ingrained in the fitrah, established by necessity. For indeed, atheism is a type of safsata, radical skepticism, which is a general condition many people fall into, whether intentionally or unintentionally, by contesting foundations known intuitively, qadaya badihiyya, or matters recognized by the al-fitra, al-ma'rif al-fitriya, in empirical and mathematical matters as well as in theology. So you see that the negation of God goes against the very fitrah that we have inside of us, the intuition. And much of the reason that we don't like to associate that to God is because if we speak of a God, we will end up in a religion, and religion is not something that many people are sympathetic towards these days. So the antidote to the aforementioned radical skepticism, per Ibn Taymiyyah, as you see, much of the episode is designed around what Ibn Taymiyyah has to say. So there is some bias over there, of course. So he says that the antidote for that is recourse to the common sense recognition that there are foundational structural elements in the conceptual architecture of the human mind that are innate, fitri, intuitive, badihi, and necessary, daruri. And upon this particular architecture, the acquisition of further knowledge is dependent. Fitri, the adjective derived from fitra, entails the natural state disposition upon which God created the human being, with a yearning to recognize him, even though, over time, fitra can become corrupted and perverted. In addition to the spiritual inclination towards God, the fitra also provides the basis for all other values and conceptualizations in the human mind, including compassion, honesty, and this is where this thing comes in, right? Where I say that I don't need a book. I don't need to believe in God, right? Because I know I'm being a good human. I'm taking care of the society. I'm taking care of the people around me. But then again, how did you define what is being good? What was your grounds, right? And therefore, this according to Ibn Taymiyyah and according to the Quranic paradigm, this intuitive knowledge, this fitri, is in our fitra. This knowledge helps us with moral judgments pertaining to particulars in the world. And it actually precedes universal abstractions about categories. The fitra contains the conceptual architecture, such as individuation and counting, that allows us to interpret our sensory encounters with the world in a manner that is meaningful. And yes, there is a fallibility of sensorial perception, but however, perceptual errors are detectable, and the basic rule is to regard our sense as trustworthy, given that they are rooted in fitra upon which we have been created. So there is always a risk. Just because there's a small risk of losing something, just because there's a small doubt, does not give us the right to cancel it completely, or reject it completely. That's what we spoke about earlier regarding the notion itself of God may be debated, but God doesn't have to be necessarily kicked out of the picture. And that is why the debate is more epistemological, not conceptual. Allah says in the Quran at one place in Surah 52, were they created by nothing? Or were they themselves the creators? Or did they create the heavens and the earth? Rather, they do not possess certitude. In another Surah 14, ayah number 10, Allah says, is there any doubt concerning God, the originator of the heavens and the earth? So, what do we do with this information, right? What do we do eventually? Who is Allah? Who wrote the Quran? And why do we have to believe in it? Why do we have to believe in a book that comes 1400 years ago? And how do we apply it in today's times? I mean, before we start doubting that, one can also say, well, if you want us to believe that revelation is happening, then why does it make sense then why can't we just simply believe in unicorns, in UFOs, in gnomes, in goblins, and host of other fictional entities? That's a very fair question to ask. And how does this skepticism differ from being skeptical about the existence of God, right? Because you can also not see God, and you can also not see UFOs, so why do we have to separate the skepticism here? Ibn Taymiyyah, again, he argues that these are physical entities posited within the material world that conflict with our experience and observation, right? And that's where you have the empiricism school of thought coming in. But, if at one point scientists declare that we have found remains of several equine or horse-like creatures that display a bony projection surrounded by some keratin arising from the head, consistent with the horn, our skepticism towards the historical existence of unicorns would reasonably diminish. On the other hand, it does not also make sense to be skeptical about the existence of good and evil. It's always going to be there. Like, we have to define certain evils. We have to define certain goods. There has to be some kind of morality out there. I like to call I love to use the phrase, this baseline morality, which I think is pretty much missing in liberal societies. What is the baseline morality that I stick to? There is this cause and effect, known as causality. There's truth and falsehood, logic. Nor does it make sense to be skeptical about the divine. Now, to be skeptical about the divine is where, we can also, we can argue about that. Like, how can I, or to what extent am I going to be skeptical about the divine given these realities of causality and morality? So, because these are not physical entities, they are rather ontological and phenomenological foundations upon which our very notions of existence and purpose are constructed and rendered meaningful. And honestly, if you take away any of this element, we no longer really have a picture of the universe that makes sense. We no longer have a sensible conception about who we are and why are we here. What is my purpose, right? This is something that we need to know. Why would we feel lost sometimes? We have instead. Then what happens basically, if you take the divinity out, we have instead a pointless sea of particles that exists reasonlessly or randomly, and whose configuration into the present world around us is as meaningless as if the particles happen to be configured in a disorganized array. Therefore, there are certain cognitive structures embedded within our fitra, and that's where this human nature comes, that helps us filter our sensory experiences into meaningful chunks of knowledge that can help us in our conceptualization of reality. It makes sense to doubt some things. It definitely does. It definitely makes sense to be doubtful about certain aspects, and especially those that conflict with the foundations of our ontology, but it doesn't make sense to doubt the ontological foundations themselves. And that's the split we need to be very, very aware of. Therefore, Ibn Taymiyyah argues that with a coherent epistemology, belief in God requires no philosophical proof. And that's pretty much the conclusion. So in the beginning where I started, like, how do I know what I know? And we talked about knowledge, we talked about epistemology, we talked about doubts and skepticism. Honestly, keeping in mind the ultimate goal of this series, it's important that we look at these basics. We look at the knowledge itself. I do not cover in my episode, and I don't know if I will cover in my episodes, if Quran is the word of Allah or not. But since this is also a question on the minds of many people, I hope with this episode I give you these frameworks, right? To when you question something, we need to ask ourselves, what am I trying to prove here? What constitutes proof for me? What do I have the knowledge that it takes? Did I learn something that did I learn the right things through which I can challenge what I'm about to challenge? And we need to try to approach the Quran with tabula rasa, right? We need to start somewhere. That's why we know we will always have a bias. And it's okay to have that bias as long as we are aware of it. Because keeping in view the discussion on fitrah, and also knowing the limitations of my own intellect, of my own biases, and honestly having realized deep within, this experience of fitrah is something that cannot be overlooked. And after having found answers to long, troubling philosophical questions, I can but not help myself, at least, falling in love with Quran again and again. There always will be differing opinions, and Allah mentions in the Quran that we are a middle nation in Surah Al-Baqarah, ayah 143, that that we don't need to sit on extremes of certain things. Sometimes we need to find the middle road. Sometimes we need to know that yes, there are going to be differing opinions, but that's the world we live in. So yes, we do need philosophy, we do need theology, we do need morality, ethical values, governing bodies, we need all of that. And that's why, for me, looking at all of this, I cannot start talking about Islam and its impact on the society or the queer communities and how they want to break free of it without first understanding the intellect, without first understanding epistemology, without first understanding the fitrah. So I must nourish critical thinking. I must understand my senses. I must understand my the reality, the basis of the reality that I've created around me. It's important to question those things and then see, okay, if I have, and that's what we learned in the previous episode, how do I avoid bias, right? One of the requirements of critical thinking is to avoid bias. So if I say I don't believe in God, I need to have a certain amount of arguments. And if I believe in God, I need to know why I believe in God. And that is something that we need to take up this challenge. So we don't feel that We are not doing it just because we are told to, but we are doing it because we have critically thought about these things. And that is exactly what Quran is inviting you to. That is exactly what I am inviting you to. So I really hope this episode gave you some, as I said, I touched some very big topics here, but I hope that it just makes you curious to research more on these things and see and look at Islam away from the social experiences we have made and the cultural experiences we have made, but look at it with a more critical lens on our eyes. Thank you so much for tuning in, and that's it from my side for today.